Good afternoon, guys. I decided at the first of the year that I'm going to start my book reviews again because a total of 4 people, I think, watched them. So I decided, why not do that at the beginning of the year? So it actually took me a little bit longer to get through the first book than what I thought it would take. So the goal originally was to do a book a week, and then kind of went down this rabbit hole that I'm going to try to get through today in a short amount of time. That took me down the historical fiction aisle, and so it actually took almost 2 months. And so I'm going to try to keep the streak up, though, from here on out with a book a week. I've got 2 more that'll be queued up, at least to get me through the first few weeks of March, and then we'll see where it goes. So today is the first book that I have ever read that had to do with historical events outside of school. I never really enjoyed history at all, American or otherwise. And so this one took me a little bit by surprise. And like I said, ended up really going down this rabbit hole of randomness of 15th century British history. So today we are going to look at The Wars of the Roses by a British author named Dan Jones. And Dan is a historical writer and a historian. He's done many shows as well as books. His first non-historical fiction, so his first fiction that is set in a historical time during the 100 Years' War, came out a few weeks ago in the U.S. called Essex Dogs. I might give that a try. That's going to supposedly be a part of a trilogy of, I think it's 4 or 5 soldiers during the 100 Years' War that's going through Britain at that time. But today, again, this one's kind of a classic, I guess, if you will. This was, I believe, his second book that he published. Third. His first one was not really well known. Second was about the Plantagenets. And then this one picks up right where the Plantagenets left off, or at least that's what the Wikipedia entry told me very, very abruptly, very quickly, because I have not read the Plantagenets, was not really interested in the Plantagenets, didn't particularly care anything about English history. What happened was Julie absolutely loves medieval British history, especially the Tudor period, and I found the Tudor period interesting. We kind of went down this rabbit hole randomly after the first of the year to look at, I believe it was one of Dan's Great British Castles. I believe that's on Netflix. And so I was interested enough to watch that. We found out that another lady Julie really likes, follows on YouTube, has for years, is also a British historian. Him and her did, I think it was a 4-parter on Henry VIII and his 6 wives. And then we also saw a show called the British Bloody Crown, or Britain's Bloody Crown, which is a 4-part series. Again, kind of going through Plantagenets, fall of the Yorks, and then the rise of the Tudors. And so I kind of found that really interesting. On top of all of that, there was also this show we had watched several years ago that we decided to pick back up and watch a second time after I watched the documentaries, because I was putting a little more name to face, a little more family tree, who was related to whom. These are all cousins anyway. And so we started watching that again on Starz, and that was the White Queen, the White Princess, the Spanish Princess. And again, this all started with a new show called The Serpent Queen that had just come out from the same producer, same director on Starz. And when we gave that a try, we enjoyed that. And then, like I said, it opened up this whole big rabbit hole. And that's kind of where I ended up going down and picking this book up. Sorry about that. I had to stop really quick. Amber was having an issue and going a little bit crazy, so I wanted to make sure that she wasn't yelling or screaming into the phone as I was trying to record. So anyway, that's how I got down this rabbit hole. And so it was a random weekend. We were in Charlotte, and I'm talking to Jules. And I said, okay, you know what I think I want to do? I'm going to give this a go. She's read so many Allison Wires. She knew who Dan Jones was. She had watched many documentaries, many shows. I'd watched very few with her, but I had watched a few. I said, I don't care about the Plantagenets. That was ignorant me. I want to see what happens. Tell me the timeline. Tell me the book. What do I pick up if I want to see where the Tudor dynasty started? So he's like, I have no idea. I've read so many. I have read individual books on very prominent people. I've went down, all of this. And she said, I don't really know where to start. We're talking to our friends, and I'm saying, okay, do you know, Jake? Where do we start? And he said, well, if you're wanting to start with the fall of the Plantagenets, the rise of the Tudors, you're going to look for the Battle at Bosworth. Okay, so Amazon I go. And that's kind of the first book that popped up was Dan Jones, The Wars of the Roses. And I said, all right, we're going to buy it on Kindle. So we got back into Florida. This was in the middle of February. And bought it, started reading it. And what I really initially just enjoyed, took me by surprise, made me continue reading, was that the way he set it up was very narrative, very detailed, not overly presenting historical fact to you in a way that made you feel like you were in the classroom. And that was my one thing, right? I had always told Julie, why read nonfiction? She reads nonfiction for the exact opposite reason that I read fiction. I want to escape. I've learned and studied so much, so many years. I basically wanted to give myself a break. And Jules was the exact opposite. Why waste my time if I'm not learning something, doing something? Because her love of reading is not as, reinforced as mine, as far as a singular love, hobby of reading. But I would akin it to her love of music, this flute that you've seen that she's put up. So I have the same type of, obsessed attitude. And like I said, the goal of one a week is what I want to do. I may go back and review what we did in January, but this one was the first one I felt compelled to get back to the video and put it out in March. And so I guess initially what I will say is it is not a hard book to read. It is not a hard book to follow. There are other authors out there. There are other prominent authors out there that have published books on the Wars of the Roses. I don't know if they're better. I don't know if they're worse, but I know I really enjoy the way Dan writes. And from the first page, he wrote, he went on down the line to when Henry VIII was very close to death, talked a little bit about his reign. So we open it that way and then immediately revert back to, again, the fall of Henry VI and how incompetent he was. So the fall of the Yorks and the rise of Edward IV. Go through that whole spiel, go through Richard III. Finally, we get to the Battle of Bosworth. The Battle of Bosworth goes through, drops, and then here we have Henry VII. It comes out of nowhere, right? So 15th century, coming off of the 100 Years' War with France, going through a ton of Lancasters and Yorks. And then, of course, we have this big reign of the Yorks go through these bloody battles, although I found out that 30 years, Wars of the Roses, only amounted to 13 battles. So that was interesting to me, because the way that it's presented on these documentaries and the way you read it, it just seems like these people were battling and that these coups were rising and these rebellions were rising like every other week. and it wasn't that way. Average battles were like between 30 and 45 minutes, Dan says, because of how heavy the armor was and how heavy the swords were, and what could you expect, right, in the battle versus surviving and dying. And so for me, I found it fascinating. I think it said something close to 29,000 people ended up dying, all because these two sets of cousins were feuding, essentially. And then out of nowhere, Henry Tudor, this kid that had only spent 3 months in England his entire life, rose to power. I think it said he had to overcome 5 different heirs to the throne over the course of this. I think it's set up to be almost 600 pages, but you have to realize over 100 pages of that are references. There are a lot of photos in there as well. Photos. There are a lot of paintings and maps in there as well. And so you really got a book of about 380, 390 solid pages of manuscript. And so you start to find all of this out. And what I found really, really helpful was to go back, read several pages or several chapters, and then Jules and I would sit down and watch it on the screen, either by searching it on YouTube or by rewatching an episode, 2 episodes, 3 episodes of those Starz shows that I was talking about. Again, produced from books of a very well-known historical fiction author, Philippa Gregory, and she does dramatize a little bit. It's not historical nonfiction. She does play out a few different turns that don't historically add up, let's say. She takes a little bit of liberty. It's not that it's not a basis of fact. It is, but she decides in her little world, what might go left or right, so to speak. But it was really neat, because then I could put a face to this king. I could put a face to this mother, or understand how we got Henry VIII's grandmother, or what she was known for, or the deaths of the princes under Richard III. And so, again, this was a very nice and easy read. And what I mean by that is someone who is not a fan of history, who would much rather be taken away in an imaginative world, Dan made it that imaginative to me to want to continue to read, and not only want to continue to read, but want to pick up another book from him. And so what I think I'm going to do now is that I'm going to go back. You will see next week the review, although I'll be finishing it up in the next day or two, of The Princes in the Tower by Alison Weir. I really enjoy her writing as well. Julie loves her writing. I found it interesting enough to go back and read about Richard III's rule after Edward IV, his brother, died, and his 2 sons, Edward IV's sons, being trapped in the Tower of London, Richard deciding to kill them so that no one could lay claim to the throne, not really worried about old Henry Tudor in France, and then lo and behold, Henry Tudor comes out, and we have, the battle. Richard dies, and Henry takes throne. And so I'm finishing up a book on that specific sequence. And then I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to go forward and read Alison's book on Henry VIII, but I will, either the next book or the book after that, go back and read Dan's The Plantagenets. I find that I just really, really like his writing. So this rabbit hole is going to get larger for me. I would give it a solid 9 out of 10. Again, coming from a guy who does not read historical nonfiction or any nonfiction. I do not like nonfiction. I will be the first to tell you and gripe and complain and say I want to be taken away from the real world. I want that imagination. I want you to go beyond my realm of what I think is possible. But Dan did it in a really fun and really creative way that made it interesting, but it also made me remember this was actual fact I mean, this is better than Game of Thrones. This really happened. These people existed. And it's hard to do that when you're thinking about 500 years ago. But he did it. He did it really well. I'm going to come back. Like I said, you're going to see several of these, at least during this time period, probably from at least 3 different authors, because I do have a couple other books from other authors in the Amazon cart. But Dan was the first one to start. If you do have any interest in this period of time, start with Dan. Whether it's the Plantagenets, whether it's the Wars of the Roses, you will not go wrong. I think you'll enjoy it. A little bonus tidbit, I subscribe to Audible. He also has a podcast on there called This is History, and he will take you back to when the first Plantagenet came across from France into England as well. So that will take you through the majority of arguably the most important time in England. So, solid 9 out of 10 for me. I hope you take it. I hope you read it. Look him up if nothing else. There's even a great conversation he had with George R.R. Martin about pulling factual events into Game of Thrones and twisting them, that you can find on YouTube as well. Great guy. Love his writing style. 9 out of 10. We're going to see you again. I'm going to start this back up next week.